session. Vivek, Program Coordinator and Research Associate here at NICE. Before we start, I would like to quickly introduce NICE. NICE is an independent, apolitical, and non-partisan think tank based in Nepal, which believes in freedom, democracy, and a world free from conflict. I would like to welcome you all to a very special session of our Tech in IR series, where we will be discussing global tech diplomacy, regulating AI in a fragmented world. For this special session, we have the esteemed Maria Shach, who is a non-resident fellow at Stanford's Cyber Policy Center and at the Institute for Human-Centered AI. She is a columnist for the Financial Times and has served on a number and serves on a number of not-for-profit boards as well as the UN's high-level advisory board on AI. Between 2009 to 2019, she served as the member of European Parliament, where she worked on trade, foreign, and tech policy. She is the author of both the book The Tech Coup. And during her time as a member of the Parliament, Shaka served on the Foreign Affairs Committee and Human Rights Subcommittee, working on EU relations with the US, Iran, Turkey, and the Middle East. She led several reports on cultural diplomacy, digital rights, and media freedom. In 2017, Shah was appointed to the Global Commission on the Stability of Cyberspace and served on the commission until its successful conclusion in 2019, participating in the drafting of its 8 norms related to non-aggression in cyberspace. She was named to Politico's 28 list and was among Politico's 40 MEPs who mattered, and the Wall Street Journal and CNN have praised her as a leading voice for liberalism, globalization, and digital rights. So thank you so much for gracing us with your presence here today, ma'am. I would like to request you to make your remarks, and then we will follow up with the Q&A session. And in the meantime, whatever questions the participants may have, please drop them below in the chat box. I would like to hand over the floor to you.
Thank you so much, Vivek, for those kind words. And it's a real pleasure to meet you. I think the goals of your institute could not be more urgent in a world that sees more aggression, violations of international law, and frankly, threats to freedom to people all around the world. So it's a real pleasure to join you. What I want to do is talk a little bit about what I'm seeing in terms of global initiatives towards AI governance. But before I start, I think it's good to know that my experience and vantage point is very much from an EU and a US perspective. So through the global work that I did as a member of the high-level advisory panel to the UN Secretary General, we also took a more global perspective, thought about particular needs of various countries and communities in the global South. But I just think it's important to know that my experience is mainly based in the EU and the US. I warmly welcome your questions, so I hope that we can make this interactive very soon. So when we look at AI governance, a couple of unique features stand out that I want to touch upon. Governments actually really stepped up to the plate, particularly after the breakthrough of ChatGPT, generative AI applications, at a very rapid pace and in a global fashion. Very different from responses to social media, for example, where there was long reluctance by governments to do anything, strong pushback by companies as well. Whereas with AI, we saw a number of calls by AI experts, including CEOs of companies, academics, and so on, cautioning that this technology might be very impactful and urging governments to regulate. This is quite unusual, but something that we've seen around AI. And indeed, governments around the world stepped up, anywhere from initiatives in the G7, at the UN, the European Union, the African Union. There was a brief moment of true convergence, a notion that AI is a global issue. It doesn't really stop at borders. And so when there are safety concerns or when there are risks to mitigate, it's best to collaborate. The Bletchley Park AI Summit, initiated by the UK government, was a moment where people met. I was there. There were leaders from different governments, academia, the tech companies. And there was also a joint declaration on stage where people from all over the world, including China, but also the African continent. And so, the idea that this was a global discussion and that there was a way to overcome differences both between competing companies and governments with very different uh, political ideologies was really tangible in the room. But that moment didn't last very long because with the re-election of Donald Trump, we are seeing the US taking a completely different approach to everything. I don't think that that's hard to appreciate, but it includes AI governance. So the third AI summit, which was only 1 year after that Bletchley Park summit last February in Paris. In between, there was one in South Korea, but it was an online summit, so it had a slightly different character. So within a year's time, the US government did not want to sign the joint declaration coming out of that AI summit. And we could all hear Vice President JD Vance scolding the Europeans, saying that regulation, is bad, that there should be an embrace of AI, but according to the US model. And the US model today means one of deregulation. We've even seen the federal government of the United States proposing a moratorium for 10 years on AI regulation by US states, which is unprecedented. So we have the US government trying to dictate what the states are and are not able to do, because, of course, in the absence of federal tech regulation, we have seen states such as California, a very powerful economy in and of itself, home to a lot of tech companies, stepping up and trying to put up guardrails to this, immensely powerful set of technologies to ensure greater data protection, for example, and things like that. So there is a dramatic turn in the approach by the US, which I think will have ripple effects to global governance, of course, because the US is home to so many powerful tech companies, and the US, is a strong voice in any multilateral forum. The G7, for example, there was also some struggles about getting to a final agreement. Given all kinds of other geopolitical tensions, it seems like tech governance is pushed to the background anyway. We're unfortunately having to deal with war, new attacks by Israel on Iran, for example, the ongoing genocide in Gaza, in Ukraine, the war of aggression by Russia. So, getting attention for tech governance in that context is harder, especially when the US is willing to give companies all the space to actually promote deregulation, because they believe that this is the best way to empower the US through its companies against China. This is really the frame through which many in America see technology as a competition, a fierce one, where everything must be done to avoid China from quote unquote winning this race. Now, in Europe, a very different approach has been taken. A binding, comprehensive law on AI has been adopted, the AI Act. It's now being implemented, so it takes some time before it's actually fully enforced. But the idea there is the use of AI can pose risks to the individuals involved. For example, if it's used for screening CVs in the job applications or for educational access, can someone enter a university, yes or no? Or maybe it's used for predictive policing or border control or customer service. There are all kinds of applications of AI that pose different kinds of risk. And so the EU has plotted these different uses on a spectrum of risk, from low risk to unacceptable risk, and has, through this law, mitigating measures that companies have to adhere to the various levels of risk involved. And thereby, the law kind of builds on known concepts like product liability, for example. And I think that that's a particular choice. So another choice could have been to really go to the core of what AI is. And if you look at the technology from that perspective, a number of different questions really surface, because whereas if you were dealing with a product, let's say a car or food or medication, then you can regulate a product also by taking it to a lab, taking it apart, and assessing whether it's meeting various criteria. With AI particularly, but a variety of technologies, that kind of insight, access to information doesn't exist in the same way. And so the mere existence of AI as a technology that is ever changing, highly individualized. Each one of us get different experiences because the generative AI models respond differently to the prompts that we give, to what they've learned from our previous queries. And so, from a regulatory perspective, unique characteristics of AI, its ever-changing nature, its highly individualized experience, but also, and I think this is probably the most important, the unpredictable nature of the AI models and applications pose unique challenges to regulation at all. If we listen to CEOs such as Dario Amodei of Anthropic, he basically says nobody really knows how generative AI does what it does. Scientists in AI, even though they know the technology well, they have broad thoughts about it, have questions about the unpredictable steps that models can take. And of course, this presents a new kind of risk for everyone. And makes it harder to regulate because if even the people who are putting these models onto the market or applications onto the market or the academics who are best versed in how AI works don't really know why certain steps are taken, then it's particularly difficult to know what the best kind of regulation is. And so I think, with the AI Act, even though it is a comprehensive law that seeks to address the risk in a variety of applications, there are fundamental challenges that remain and that I have not seen anyone around the world tackling. Now, zooming out a bit to that global perspective, there are big differences in where countries are and what communities can do with AI or what they need. At the UN level, we had a number of discussions about, how can you think about AI when you don't have access to electricity? And I think there's just a big gap between all kinds of futuristic perspectives on, what AI might mean for science, for medicine, for warfare, for the economy that are happening in countries like the US, but also European countries, and the specific needs or challenges that a number of people in the global South experience. And there, I think there are a couple of key themes that emerge. One is people are wary of exacerbated inequality, which makes sense. There's already too much inequality in the world, and the concern is that AI can exacerbate that inequality. There is concern that the vast majority of people in the world live in countries that don't have access to supercomputing. So there's only a handful, a couple of countries, I think around 40, maybe 45, that have access to supercomputing. And so the bulk of countries don't. And so that also has impact for what people can develop, research, and so on. And of course, there are big questions about the interest that others might have, whether it's countries or companies, in rolling out AI in different countries around the world, and where the instrumentalizing of technology, for example, by state security services, can also go at the expense of people's rights. Because besides living in countries where there's not necessarily access to AI for ordinary people, there are a lot of people living in countries where there are no rights protecting frames around the use of technology. In my book, The Tech Coup, I highlight an example that I experienced myself. In 2017, was the chief observer of the elections in the country, Kenya, which unfortunately is seeing new unrest and violence by the police against peaceful protesters once more. But the reality there was that the government was actually quite keen to take on digitization as a objective. And particularly a number of Chinese companies, of course, are happy to push their technologies into African societies. But actually, there was no data protection law. And so if people's rights are not protected, there is a law now, but there was in 2017. And for example, elections were relying on biometric information. Then obviously you also have a rights question, not just a development question. And I think it's really important to not forget that because there tends to be a lot of focus on, okay, how can we get access to AI to most people around the world. But the context in which AI is used, whether people's rights are protected, whether there are frameworks of oversight, is really key. And even when they exist, the technology itself poses new kinds of challenges. And the broad theme that I address, which I think is also very tangible with AI, is that there's a very significant power asymmetry between the private companies and democratic governments or communities writ large. The real power, insight, ability to make decisions, to take risk, to decide whether a product is ready to be put out, even if there are concerns about discrimination or safety. All those decisions are really made by companies that have a profit incentive, and the public interest around the world can suffer from that. And that's the key issue that I describe in the tech coup, how tech companies have grabbed so much power at the expense of the rule of law and democracy. And I think that actually societies that have not yet digitized so much as we have in Europe or as they have in the United States should use that as an opportunity to really rethink what kind of role do we see in our lives, in our societies for AI and other technologies, so that we are very clear on what we find acceptable, and that there's not a new kind of colonialism, particularly in the use of tech, that's not just coming from countries that may have their objectives with the rollout of certain technologies, but certainly also from companies that create new dependencies, lacks of freedom in completely new ways that I think are great to avoid while you still can. So let me leave it there, if that's okay, and we can jump to the Q&A. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, ma'am. You've pointed out a lot of interesting things. Like maybe I think because of the rapid development of AI that we are seeing, there's a huge surge that is causing so much confusion between the regulators, and they're having to like go forward and coming backwards at the same time. My first question is like you highlighted this thing about this new colonialism might be happening soon or may not. So my first question is how can smaller or developing countries ensure that they have a voice in global tech diplomacy, especially when regulatory standards are being shaped predominantly by powerful blocs like the EU and the US?
Well, I think it's always helpful to begin by being clear about what your ideal scenario would be for yourself. So, to have a model or proposal on what AI governance would best look like for people in Nepal, for example, then assess whether this is something that is similar to other countries. Maybe it is similar to neighboring countries or other countries around the world. In other words, to try to find as critical a mass as possible around this model. And then to maybe see, is it similar to what is already out there? US approach, EU approach, maybe Indian approach, maybe Chinese approach, and then to take it forward from that perspective. So to try to say, look, we can adopt this standard, but we need this from you. So to engage in negotiation and to look at what level of the agenda points you can work with whom. So I think, for example, the question of specific needs for people in the global south is quite high on the agenda at the UN. But then there are specific needs for Nepal that are not the same as they would be for, I don't know, Nigeria for that matter. And so to be sure that people know what your unique needs are and that you know it yourself, so that you can then have a strategy towards getting there. I don't know how developed these discussions are in Nepal, for example. Maybe a context of a regional multilateral initiative like ASEAN could be interesting to engage with, to see if that is more relatable to what it is you're trying to achieve. Do you want me to take questions from the chat, or are you going to do
Yeah, I
that?
can do it for you.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you, ma'am, for your answer. I think if you're talking about in the context of Nepal, we're just getting started. We just had into 2025, we've had the first AI bill, and we are in the process of trying to regulate AI. So my second question is, your work highlights the tension between the EU's Perspective AI Act, the UK's pro-innovation approach, and the US's resilience on voluntary commitments. How can we prevent this regulatory fragmentation from creating a race to the bottom while fostering innovation? Should we prioritize harmonization or accept the different democratic models will naturally produce different AI governance approaches?
It's a great question. I think fragmentation is unavoidable, but it should still be avoided to the extent possible, meaning the fact that the US and indeed the UK are taking a different approach, basically saying fewer rules, more investment, more room for companies, also means that countries that don't want to see this, so that want to double down on the protection of democracy, want to double down on safety standards, for example, that they work together better. And so I think that the tendency, especially in Europe right now, is to really be open to new coalitions because the loss of the United States as a key ally for Europeans is a very shocking experience. Since World War II, the liberation of the continent from Nazism and then communism has really made the relationship with the United States something that's emotional, even if it's been very difficult in the past. It's also something that has been an anchor for people, for better or worse, for as long as everybody who is alive now knows. So, for the past 80 years roughly. And that also means that there's room to rethink. And that is happening in a broader context of the loss of power of the collective democracies in this world, right? If you look at reports from the VDEM Institute in Sweden, you see steady decline of democracy around the world for the past 20 years, which is very, very worrying. And so, yeah, there's just a need to be more strategic, more deliberate if we want to preserve those democratic rights nationally and internationally, and also in new contexts like that of AI and technology.
Thank you, ma'am. The next question we have is looking ahead as AI capabilities advance towards artificial general intelligence, how should democratic institutions evolve their governance approaches to remain relevant and effective? What would dynamic, flexible guardians of our digital world look like in practice? And how can we build these capabilities before it's too late?
It's a great question, and I think there's no real answer right now, but there must be more effort to get to the answer. And I think one solution really lies in trying to create some time between the innovative part of developing new AI capabilities and releasing them into the public. Right now, there's basically no time in between. And so, again, companies can decide, okay, we have a new model, we're willing to throw it out into the public because actually, when people engage, the models improve. And so, this is in the interest of the companies. But for a number of other innovations, think about medicine, for example, one, there's a much more controlled environment in which innovation can happen. You cannot just have pharmacists that develop new medicine and then let people use it and see, did someone die or not? What was the outcome? We actually have strong, strong rules in most societies around medical trials, about clinical tests, about the information that needs to be accompanying the use of pharmaceuticals. So, on the level of the doctors, on the level of the pharmacists, on the level of the consumers, there are all kinds of ways in which risk is prevented. The idea being medicine should help and should not accidentally kill people or make them ill, even though they're supposed to make people better. And we just don't have those kinds of steps around AI yet. And we also don't have a good ability to learn in the public interest. We have a lack of transparency, a lack of access to information, a lack of independent research, even at universities like Stanford. I mean, it's important to talk about the special needs of communities and people in the global south, but I think it's important to note that there is no real perfect situation in the most developed economies and countries either. So when I talk to my colleagues at Stanford who are computer scientists who want to research AI, the most advanced research access to information can be found within companies, and there is no public equivalent nowhere in the world. And so this really means that there's also knowledge asymmetry, which makes it very hard to actually know what's going on because we typically don't trust what companies who have a clear stake in a product say about the product. When car manufacturers say that their cars are safe, we don't say, okay, thank you, but we want to have independent testing to verify whether this is true. And so these kinds of mechanisms of having more independent understanding, testing, guardrails, etc., need to be stood up. And in the process of doing that, I'm sure we will learn a whole lot about how governance itself needs to improve. Because indeed, the old models of how you regulate tin cans with food in them cannot apply to how AI works. It's much less visible. We have very new challenges going on. But there are, of course, core legal principles, non-discrimination, antitrust, uh, um, civil liberties, concerns for national security, so many aspects that cannot be disrupted by any technology, including AI. And so it's a question that is still unresolved. It's relatively early, of course. You know, the breakthroughs in the AI are relatively new on our agendas. But I think what's really important is that it's not just about trying to tackle the tech aspect, but also focusing on how governments and the regulatory process themselves need to change.
Thank you, ma'am. You mentioned earlier about your experience working in the elections in Kenya. So my next question is, uh, AI has posed challenges in democratic states where voters are getting manipulated. So in this context, how should AI be strengthened to help the strengthening of these democratic practices?
Well, I think one crux is that because there's been a lot of debate about AI, right? Deep fakes, synthetic content that can be misleading. That's harder and harder for people to appreciate as not coming from people. But the platforms upon which this information spreads, especially around elections, remains social media platforms. You know, you can have a deep fake, but if you cannot spread it, then nobody's going to see it. And so I think we are still wrestling with what Shoshana Zuboff calls the surveillance capitalism model, you know, data collection on people that is then exploited against people, whether it is to sell them more stuff than they wish, you know, they had, or whether to manipulate their opinions or to defraud them or what have you. And I think this is something that still needs to be tackled pre-AI, with AI, etc. In Europe, there's a new law that might be worth looking at. It's called the Digital Services Act. And it actually imposes obligations on tech companies to have in place proper content moderation mechanisms. It doesn't talk about where the limits of free speech are, but it puts obligations on companies to make sure that harmful content, you know, terrorist content or hateful or discriminatory or manipulative content does not get spread. And governments can actually also address a newly emerging situation. So let me give you an example. On an everyday level, it's, you know, it's legal in the EU to say things about healthcare that are absolutely untrue. So to say things like, if you drink this tea, it will cure you from cancer, for example. No scientific proof, but it's not illegal. But if we get into a pandemic situation as we did with COVID, and false claims about public health are leading to public health concerns, for example, because more and more people do not trust the vaccines anymore, then you have a sort of tipping point where false content and scaling of it and the change of behavior are leading to a different reality. And so that could mean, you know, a different obligation on the part of companies in that context, if that makes sense. And so this could be an interesting example to just sort of learn from. It's a relatively new law. There are also questions about what's good about it, what's bad about it. There are interestingly transparency provisions. So to allow researchers to do more independent understanding and learning of how the tech companies work, which I think is one of the more interesting parts of it. And the law also addresses some systemic problems like the undermining of the democratic process, which companies should take responsibility for. And we've seen the European Commission issue two data retention orders. One, when there were suspicions about the role that TikTok played in Romania in manipulating the elections. And two, the role that X, Elon Musk's social media platform, formerly known as Twitter, played in the German elections. So it's a new law that we are all learning to see how it works, whether it's achieving the outcomes that people had hoped for. But I think this is a good sort of space to watch when we think about how to prevent manipulation. And what you'll see is that AI offers new potential, but it still very much requires the use of social media platforms where a lot of questions about, you know, how to prevent harm have not been answered. And so we are in part having to reckon with old questions when we are having to answer the new challenges of synthetic content for manipulation.
Thank you, ma'am. I think we just discussed about AI versus non-state actors. There's this another question related to on the context of elections related to like AI versus state actors. So the question is, to what extent do AI-driven disinformation campaigns pose a greater threat to electoral integrity compared to traditional methods of interference used by actors like Russia and China?
It sort of depends on what kind of traditional method of interference one thinks of, but I think we need to think about agendas of hostile actors as being integral, so that they use all the tools in the toolbox, of which disinformation is one, but maybe cybercrime is another, maybe espionage or full attacks is yet another. I think the context, greatly differs depending on where you are. Ukraine is a victim of a war of aggression by Russia, but Russia is also trying to interfere in a number of European countries. So it's important, I think, to understand that in the hostilities between countries, the full spectrum of tools is used, and in that full spectrum, tech plays a growing role.
Okay, ma'am. The next question is, should democratic countries prioritize aligning their AI governance approaches to counter authoritarian models? Or is it good to diversify even in democratic AI regulation? Is this a strength?
Well, I think coordinating with like-minded countries is always a good idea. So to scale among shared valued partners is a good idea. But then frequently you'll see that the implementation is different in every country because of differences in legal systems, differences in, the needs or the political models. So even if you aspire to achieve the same goal, there can be national implementation, which is, I think, unavoidable.
Okay, ma'am. I think we are in the. I'll ask you one final question before we part ways. So the question is, in an increasingly polarized geopolitical climate, what is the most strategic way to build consensus on regulating frontier on AI technologies?
Um, so I think it would require more of that trying to understand the models before starting with developing rules. So the kind of tension that I laid out around the AI Act, which is very much regulating the application level, the moment when AI meets a person, a consumer, does not address those fundamental questions. And I think the most important is actually how are we going to be able to regulate a technology like AI when there's such a fluidity in its manifestation, so constantly changing, unpredictable, highly individualized, and with the core information in the hands of companies. I think these are more cross-cutting challenges around the world, actually, irrespective of whether we sit in democracies or authoritarian countries. This is a problem that AI presents, and that I don't see enough energy being devoted to try to crack and answer.
Thank you, ma'am. I think we've run out of time, but despite the time constraint, we've had a very interesting session here today. So I would like to thank you very much for your time, and a big thank you to all the participants who joined us today. And I think with this, we will part ways. If you have any parting words.
Well, I just want to thank you for the invitation. It's not often that I engage with people from Nepal, and I hope to visit your beautiful country one day. And I hope that your institute is able to help us understand and address some of the core challenges that new technologies, including AI, pose for the Nepalese people, which I'm sure is not understood by everybody. And so I think you have important work to do.
Thank you, ma'am. If you're ever in Nepal, please let us know. We'd be happy to host you. So thank you.
Pleasure. Thank you so much and have a beautiful day.